Hey listeners, this is Ruth Servan-Smith. Our True Believer project is done, but TJ and I wanted to come back for one more episode. It's an episode I've wanted to do almost since I began working with TJ on True Believer. It just took me a long time to figure out how to do it. When the Creve Coeur Police Department began investigating Elizabeth Mackintosh's death in 1990, they asked whether anyone at Covenant Seminary had previously done anything concerning or suspicious. Of course, the question makes sense. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, there were troubling stories about people on campus. And that led the police to consider several suspects in Elizabeth's murder. But the question didn't lead to anything that could close the case. And we've talked about why. The police felt like they had some good leads on some people, but nothing definitive. And of course, just due to the passage of time and how the evidence was used, there's not really any more hard evidence that could close the case unless somebody confesses. So the likelihood of linking Elizabeth's murder to memories and actions in 1990 has overall decreased. But I've always wondered if there is another way to look at the case. So as we worked on this project, I sent Covenant Seminary's 1990 directories to people in the PCA and asked a different question. Do you know if any of these people, men or women, were flagged for church discipline or crimes after 1990? And that also got us some answers. Over time, I built a list of names. It included men accused of spiritual abuse, sexual abuse, and domestic violence, both from that 1990 class and later. And some of those men also became leaders in the PCA. I'm not saying any of those people have anything to do with Elizabeth Mackintosh's death, but the ones there in 1990 did take classes and work at the seminary where she was murdered. They walked through the chapel where she died. They probably knew her killer, too, on campus and, again, maybe later. So over the past year, as TJ and I worked on this project, dozens of people have reached out. They've told us about pastors who mistreated them, harassed them, threatened them, or overlooked the abuse of others. And TJ and I have always had a little bit of a conflict. We wanted to talk to those people, of course. We appreciated that they told us their stories, but we decided we simply couldn't investigate every complaint that we got about PCA pastors. But I do want to tell you about one person credibly accused and then disciplined for misconduct. Like most other people in this series, we'll refer to this pastor only by his first name, Ian. He was a student at Covenant in 1990. He worked first in South Carolina and then in Tennessee. Now, of course, it's important to say that Ian is not a known suspect in the death of Elizabeth Mackintosh, though he was apparently questioned by police at the time, along with other students on campus. So why am I bringing him up in particular? In 2023, Ian was deemed unfit to lead his church after a sexual misconduct allegation was made public by the Tennessean newspaper. That story was reported by friend of the podcast, Liam Adams, but there is more to the story. The case against Ian helped me understand how a denomination with so many good and kind people can apparently fumble complaints against their peers. I mentioned my list. There's no known database of abusive pastors in the PCA. I'm not sure that anyone else has ever tried to make a list. Men who are censured by the national denomination for heresy or other kinds of misconduct are listed in a document each year, but you have to really dig through a lot of national and local records to even try to figure out what happened. And lots of complaints never make it that far. Many cases are, essentially, secret. And there's a cascading effect to that secrecy. If complaints are never heard, if witnesses are never asked, and questions are never answered, some abuse remains covered up. That is, at least, until someone decides to go public. In this episode, you'll hear from a woman named Morgan. Now, before we get into her story, I should say she reached out to me in 2023 after we had started airing True Believer. She had a story she wanted to tell about her pastor. She had previously talked to a journalist about the story, but had been anonymous, and so over the last year, we had some back and forth about whether she wanted to go public under her name. She decided to do so. She thought it was important. And so here, for the first time, you'll hear Morgan's story attached to her name. We are still not going to use her last name, but you'll hear her story in more detail than has been published previously. In 2009, she moved to Nashville. She found a small church, then called Grace Presbyterian, where she felt welcomed and valued, and where she became friends with the pastor, Ian, and his family. Here's Morgan.
The relationship was music ministry and youth ministry initially. So I came in the summer. In late fall was when I started kind of being around their family more. I went on a women's retreat, which is kind of the first, I guess, friendship connection I had with his wife. And then we got home from that retreat, and I'd never been to their home before. And I think we got back at some point on a Sunday, and we had youth group that evening. And I remember they called me and said, hey, we're going to have youth group at the house, where we typically had it at the building where we met for church. And that was kind of the start of a more personal relationship.
As we talked, Morgan told me a lot about how much she loved her church. She threw herself into helping with all sorts of things, especially music and the youth group. But in 2010, she was over at Ian's house, getting a computer charger she had left behind earlier, and out of the blue, Ian did something that stunned her.
At some point pretty soon into that conversation, he started rubbing my back, which I felt uncomfortable about. But it was one of those things where it was like, obviously I'm wrong here. This is a pastor and a family man, and he's my pastor. Like, I'm just being crazy.
Was it under your shirt or over your shirt?
Initially, it was over my shirt, and eventually, I mean, I don't think this is probably over the span of a minute, maybe, into the over the shirt back rub. So I used to, just for the sake of context, I'm a little insecure about my body. So I've always had a habit of, I love to wear a hoodie. I had just worked out. So I had these sweatpants on, and I would always like tuck in my t-shirt into the sweatpants, put my hoodie over that. So he's like rubbing my back. Well, he reached down and untucked the back of my shirt out of my sweatpants, and then reached up my shirt and then was rubbing my back. And I was pretty stunned by that point. It was like, okay, obviously this is not okay. Very uncomfortable. I was a little bit frozen for a second, like, what do I do? And just having flashes of like, still a little bit thinking maybe I'm being the crazy one here. Partly because, their living room at that time, it wasn't wide open like an open concept, but there was a doorway that went into the dining room kitchen area, another doorway that went back into another hallway. And the kids were just living normal life. So part of me was thinking, this is normal, right? Like, he wouldn't just be doing this when like any one of his kids could come in at any moment. The other part of me was like, oh my gosh, what if his kids come in here and think something's happening, So at some point, like probably relatively quickly, I kind of just popped up and was like, oh, I gotta go. I really need to get home. And I kind of rushed out. And he was like, oh, come stay, And I was like, no, I gotta go. And I kind of basically ran out and drove away, and then realized I didn't even grab my stupid charger. So I had to call him and be like, hey, I forgot my charger. And he actually ended up like driving the charger to me, and we had like a window to window exchange. I got home and was trying to gather my thoughts, like, am I being crazy? Like, just confused and really uncomfortable. So I decided I would text him and just said, hey, that was really uncomfortable. Like, I can't remember what all I said, but I do remember saying that was really uncomfortable. I didn't like that at all. And he said he was sorry, didn't mean to make me feel uncomfortable. And then I was like, okay, so is this I still felt uncomfortable after that. Like, I think just because it was such an isolated thing, like only he knew and I knew that that happened, and I felt really uncomfortable. So I texted his wife, which I felt pretty bad about given that she was on vacation, but I was like, I just need there to be some knowledge that this, something happened. So I texted her and said, "Hey, something uncomfortable just happened with Ian. I think I handled it." She called me immediately. I told her what happened. She seemed upset. Said, "I gotta go." And then it was like ghosted for the rest of the week. And so then I was like, "Oh, did I do something wrong?" Like, I kind of felt a little like maybe I was in trouble or something. Like, yeah. When she got back in town, it was, I think, the day of the flood. She got back in town and church was canceled the next day. So she said, "Why don't you jot some things down in your journal? Come on over. We'll all talk about it." And she's a therapist. There's more context to that too, but I trusted her. We're going to work this out or whatever. And so she had me tell him why I felt uncomfortable. I really don't remember him saying anything. He kind of just had a stoic, just flat line face, facial expression of just like, wondered if he was even listening actually. But, so we had this discussion and then that was it.
And it was only the three of you.
Yeah.
You don't know if anybody else was ever told about it. And did you ever tell anyone else about it at the time?
I would put some big money on the fact that nobody was ever told by them about it. No, I didn't say anything to anyone. So I was pretty loyal to their family by that time. So the Christmas thing really sort of catapulted the relationship into a deeper connection. I started spending a lot more time with their family generally, like go to their games, go to their recitals, help them with their schooling and things like that. Be around the house to just help with things. They kind of like basically said, "Oh, you're part of the family now." And I was, I guess, hungry for a familial connection like that. So partly I felt embarrassed that that happened, but also felt like maybe I had overreacted because they didn't seem to elevate it to a level that seemed...
Sure. You're picking up on cues and there's nothing else is being done. Yeah. Morgan told me that she felt loyal to the whole family, not just the pastor. She went to their sports games and the kids' music recitals. She spent holidays with them, and she just didn't want to give all of that up. So she continued working with the church and going to church and tried her best to put the incident behind her. Then, in the summer of 2011, a few months later, something else weird happened. She found out that Ian had been at her house without her permission and presence and hit her neighbor's fence with his car. He said he was trying to fix something at her house, and Morgan thought that was weird since she hadn't asked him to help. She told him, "Hey, don't show up at my house without me," and, again, put it behind her. But the main story Morgan really wanted to tell me about happened in October 2011. She was spending a sick day at home in bed, sleeping and trying to sleep, after being disturbed by her roommate. Here's her describing what happened next.
Went back to try to go back to sleep. I don't know if I actually fell asleep or not, but I heard again the doors burst open, and I thought to myself at this point, like, good grief, like, what does she need now? But when I looked, it was Ian, and I mean just beelined it from the door across my room into the bathroom. And I was a little bit like, I shouldn't say a little bit, I was very stunned to the point of like, I didn't know if I could believe what I was seeing was reality, because it was like, oh geez, like, what is he doing in my room? And here I am just like cocooned up into my covers and watching him. And so he walked with a purpose, crossed the room into the bathroom, went straight into I had a linen closet, and they're open to the door to the linen closet, and grabbed a pair of my underwear out of my dirty laundry and started smelling them. And at that point, I was very stunned. And I would say, the fight, flight, freeze, I was definitely frozen. And I'll have to just contextually say, as a kid, my worst fear was that somebody would intrude in the middle of the night while I was sleeping. So this was actually like a manifestation of a childhood worst fear that honestly, never stopped being a fear of mine, was a reality. So I'm just frozen watching him, and I remember having this thought of, I realize this isn't a sensical thought, but I thought, if I don't say something in this moment, he will never know I saw him, and I won't be able to say something about it later. I know that doesn't make any sense, but I felt like if he didn't know he was seen, later, if I brought it up after the fact to say, hey, I saw you do this, that he could just say, no, I didn't, But I realized that isn't a logical thing. So this actually, in hindsight, I'm a little impressed with myself that I was able to speak or utter anything in that moment. But I decided I would just say his name. I don't think I decided that. It's just what I could utter in the moment. So I said, Ian, and he flipped around quickly, and when he saw me finally, recognized that I was actually there, he had this immediate, shock surprise face, but in a split second, this was maybe the most terrifying thing about it, other than the fact that he was in my house without permission, but that he turned around, shocked looking, and then immediately the pastoral countenance, just complete morph of his facial expression. He started walking towards me, and he's about 6'4", I'd say at least 250. He's a very large man. So when he turned around, his face changed, he started walking toward me. I initially thought, oh my gosh, he's going to kill me. And he started walking towards me and saying, with a kind of a concerned voice, very trying to communicate care. Oh, no, what are you doing here? Do you not feel good? And I was kind of what? Oh, I live here. What are you doing here? I don't think I was able to say anything else. I'm pretty sure if I spoke, I was completely dissociated from my body at that point. But he did come, and he came towards me. He sat right next to my head, and I'm kind of curled up in these covers. He sat right next to my head, and I thought, okay, this is it. He's gonna snap my neck, and no one will ever know that he did this, But he obviously he didn't do that. But he started stroking my hair and, oh, are you okay? Are you not feeling well? And I don't know how long he sat there. It probably wasn't very long. It felt like it was a very long time. And then he left, and I must have laid there for a couple of hours afterwards, just trying to figure out what just happened. Was that real? What do I even do now? And I'm going to ask him, what were you doing in my house? I saw what you did, and I felt this sense of I'm going to stick up for myself, but I couldn't do it. I wish that I don't know if I wish that I could. I don't know what would have happened if I did, and so I felt that I had this, sorry, you would think that the actual event would be the hardest part. I think the hardest part was just not talking about it for a really long time. But those were just some really dark days, not talking about it and feeling like I couldn't. I knew enough at that point in my PCA journey to know that the elders were the people to go to about that. But at the time, I kind of saw it as if I do that, then I'm the person who's going to pull the last support out from underneath the foundation of this church. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be the reason why this church dissolves, implodes, whatever you want to say, and changes everyone's lives, because that's my community. But also there are other people, and I won't use their names either, but a friend of mine who's now in her 60s and never been married, and that has been her community for 30 years. Another woman who was exited a terrible marriage and found refuge in that community. I mean, the stories of the beautiful people that filled those seats in that church. I think I just kind of felt like if I say something, it just all gets blown to pieces.
Morgan kept the secret of Ian's intrusion to herself for weeks and then months. She said she confronted Ian about it, but he blew her off. In May 2012, Morgan and Ian argued about the incident by email, and I've seen those emails, by the way. Ian vaguely apologized. Morgan also felt like she had to tell his wife, Anne-Marie, and Anne-Marie said she couldn't get involved.
Now, I feel even more like I can't talk about this because you can't even talk about this or help me, and he's not even engaging this at all. He's content to just carry on as if nothing ever happened. And so I was kind of like, okay, well, I guess I just have to absorb this, and try to move on like I did the first time. But it became increasingly difficult. She also shared with me in that conversation that he was angry that I had confronted him and told him he needed to tell his wife what happened. And then I told his wife what happened, that he was angry about that. I was just like, well, that speaks volumes, doesn't it? Because there was also days in between when I confronted him and when I told his wife. So it's not as if he was chomping at the bit to tell her what happened, but also like he's not the victim in this situation.
I want to say here that as a reporter, I've worked on multiple stories about different kinds of sexual assault and misconduct. While some people report an incident to police or a loved one right away, it is pretty common for a survivor to keep the story to themselves, sometimes for a long time. It can be hard to understand from the outside, but Morgan told me she didn't trust or want to be around Ian, but she also didn't want to be pushed out of her church. And all of her closest friends went to that church too. She felt like she couldn't tell them about what had happened, so she stayed silent. And she stayed silent for years. Eventually, Morgan did move to another state, and the story came out to her new pastor. In late 2019, Morgan's new pastor in Georgia told her story to the Nashville Presbytery's Shepherding Committee. One twist is that Ian was chair of that committee. Morgan was told the elders looked into the case, that Ian admitted to the incident, and that he was repentant. But she never received an apology or saw a confession, and she herself was never interviewed by the committee. She was told the issue was closed in 2021.
This doesn't just affect me. This affects everyone who's ever been involved in his ministry, anyone who's ever been friends with him. It affects his family. And all of those people don't understand why 2 reports had to be made. And really the reason why 2 reports had to be made was because my pastor, his whole goal was to push this to the presbytery level so that the right people would be making decisions. The people who were accountable to make those decisions would be making those decisions about what to do. And we were told that it did reach the presbytery level when in fact it actually did not reach the presbytery level, which we didn't find out until later. So we pushed it. They basically said at the end, it was sometime in 2021 that they kind of came back with this, okay, we've done all of our investigation, whatever that means, which I think just meant lunch with Ian. We've done all this investigation, and this was 10 years ago. It was a really long time ago. Ian is repentant, so we're not going to take any action. And that was not only insulting, but just impossible for me to wrap my head around. Because I was like, do these men understand what repentance means? And two, repentance and accountability are two separate things. So it was just mind-boggling to me. At that point, we had been pushing for some kind of answer and accountability for a year and a half. And I was exhausted of trying to make these people care about this. And so my pastor said to me at that time, we can keep pushing for what we think is right, but we don't have to. It's up to you. And I was just like, look, I have to move on. And these are the men who have to answer to God for overseeing these shepherds. And I'm going to leave it in the Lord's hands.
I should say here that I've tried to reach out to Ian for his version of the story, but he has not responded to my request for comment. In other media coverage by the Tennessean, Ian, through his counsel, declined to comment about the allegations. In one story, his representative did deny the allegations and say they planned to fight them, which they did. So Morgan moved on, or tried to, but the presbytery's response to her complaint kept bothering her. And since she had been told by pastors to keep the investigation quiet, she still felt like secrets were piling up and impacting her relationship with her friends in Nashville. In 2022, Morgan opened up to someone who had previously gone to Grace Presbyterian, and she found out for the first time about a previous complaint against Ian.
And she brought to my knowledge, I had no knowledge of this, but she said, he was disciplined previously for inappropriate sexual behavior. And I was like, what? I kind of felt like, I can't believe I don't know this, because I was so close with his wife. It seems like I can understand why she wouldn't bring it up, but it was shocking to me that I didn't know that. And I was like, what? I was like, what? And she said, I don't really know the details about it, but it was some inappropriate relationship with a member of the congregation.
So let me give some background. In 2004, someone at the church noticed interactions between Ian and a woman named Tracy. The pastor seemed inappropriately affectionate toward Tracy, kissing her head, rubbing her feet, and things like that. The shepherding committee investigated, but saw the issue almost like a consensual affair. Tracy apologized in a meeting, and Ian was put on a 6-month probation. Now, thinking about that now, that doesn't seem like an equal punishment. And so in 2023, looking back on things 20 years later, Tracy told a reporter that she now thinks, I kind of felt like I'd been groomed, and she really did use that word, to accept inappropriate behavior from her pastor. And that the church, when it found out about it, didn't really take a look at him and wonder if he was crossing the line in ways that should be really taken seriously. It felt like they made it her mess up more than his.
This is kind of the first inclination of like, I'm not the only person that something like this has happened to. It's just blew my mind a little bit into this spiral of, this is patterned behavior. This is a persistent pattern of behavior. I wasn't just a targeted person. He has taken advantage of somebody else in the past. And now that's almost a 10-year span between her and me. And at that point, it was almost a 10-year span between my second incident or I guess it was 10 years, and present day at that time. And it started to really I suddenly had a lot of fear of if this is a patterned behavior, there could be so many other people, and he's a danger to the people that he is supposedly shepherding.
Bear with me here, but as Morgan processed that news about Tracy, she found out that her 2019 complaint against Ian hadn't actually been officially handled at all. We're not going to get into all the back and forth about the PCA, church court, how all of that works, but suffice it to say, her case was essentially handled in backrooms, not through official channels.
And I was like, are you kidding me? That was a year and a half I will never get back. Like, just utter darkness of I just cut off these important relationships. I lost my community. I started talking about maybe the hardest thing that I've ever had to talk about. And a year and a half later, it's all null and void. There's no record of it, really. Nothing official that it even ever happened. And so I just kind of said, if that's the right way to do it, let's do it that way. Let's just do it the right way. And so it was kind of like a redo. Let's do it the right way. It'll get to the right place this time. We'll make sure of it.
So Morgan decided to do it all over again. She submitted formal charges against Ian in 2023. This time, the Nashville Presbytery formed a special commission to investigate the case, and Morgan began meeting with elders who were assigned to investigate it.
Every time we met with the commission, they seemed compassionate. They seemed to really care. But then we're not seeing anything happen. And at some point, I said to the commission, hey, I just want you to know that the most damaging part of all of this for me has been not talking about it. And I haven't been talking about it out of respect for this process, to not cause any outward thing to affect the process. But I'm at a point now where I can no longer do that. And I'm not going to proliferate this information and announce it to the world. But I'm also, when my friends ask me how I'm doing, I'm not going to keep the biggest thing that's happening in my life from them anymore. And I think that was maybe in May that I'd said that. And they kind of said, it's your story. You can tell whoever you want. But, caveat, this could cause the process to draw out even more. And we don't really need people, busting our door down, about this. And I kind of was like,
how would you talking to your friends prolong the process? What does that have anything to do with it?
I think that they were saying, if I was in close relationship with a handful of people who were still at the church. And if they say, hey, what's going on in your life? And I just kind of say, well, actually, spill the beans to them. Well, they're a member of his church. They're going to be busting down, quote unquote, busting down the doors of Presbytery, kind of being butting into the process, that it would complicate things, that it would, and I think in hindsight, because I actually really respect the commission for their work. They did an excellent work, I think. Here's the problem. The problem is not those men at all. The problem is the process. And they were trying to protect the process for the sake of, if they censured him and he appealed, then his censure can get overturned on the basis that the process was tampered with or not done properly or any of those things. And so effectively they have to protect the process at all costs, right? Otherwise, their work is null and void. I didn't know that at the time. At the time, I was just like, maybe people need to be busting your door down, and so I believe those men had good intentions, but the process is messed up. At that point, the process is costing me my own emotional, spiritual, and actually even my physical health. It had affected me in the weirdest physical ways that were just the hardest things to work through.
Morgan told me, and really she told me this over and over, she respects the men who are handling her case, but she feels like the PCA is just not fundamentally set up to manage certain types of issues. Remember, these church courts are often set up really to deal with heresy more than misconduct. The denominational processes, she thinks, are particularly ill-designed to help women abused by pastors. At each step of the way, her case was reviewed and judged by men. Morgan did form a team of advocates around her. Any women in the room, though, during those meetings, were there because she invited them.
I do think one of the things that I realized through this process is that while these men really did the best job I think that somebody can do with what they're given as far as the process goes, and in terms of their compassion and the way they communicated with me when they did communicate, and for the most part, they are also, it's impossible for them to understand what it must be like as a woman in her own bedroom, in her own bed, in probably the most vulnerable place that you can be, to have a 6'4", 200 and something pound man intrude into your home, and then the power imbalance that's there as a woman. I just don't think a man can understand. I think they can intellectually hear that, but there's no way a man can understand what that feels like to be in such a vulnerable position. And even if he was like 5'10" and skinny, it would have felt equally, maybe not equally, he's a very large person, but I just don't think a man can understand that fully like a woman can understand that. And not just that one component, but the emotional toll that it takes, the reasons why a person may or may not speak. I want to think the best of that shepherding committee. It's entirely possible that because they only talked to him and they didn't understand why, and they didn't ask me why, and they didn't try to understand from a female perspective, why would a person wait for that long before they speak? It may have changed everything for there just to be some women involved in the leadership teams that handled those cases. Not only that, but I just say this to say, while I was a vulnerable person, I'm not the most vulnerable person, right? I'm well educated. I am able to sort of confront things to a certain point, obviously back then, way less than now, and speak up for myself and really push on the process here. But not everybody has that opportunity. Not everybody has an education. Not everybody understands the PCA. It's very hard to understand. And I've been in the PCA a long time, and I didn't understand 10% of what I have come to understand since then. Not everybody has an advocate. So for women to be a part of how these things are handled and making these decisions and interpreting, somebody needs to be able to feel like, as a woman, I can come forward and meet with this team, and there's a chance maybe somebody in that group might get me. They might understand where I'm coming from. Not from a cognitive, this is what the story is kind of perspective, but from I can put myself in her shoes in a way that these people cannot. And I think it's surprising when anyone would come forward and have these kind of meetings, because that was a very difficult thing to do. But yeah, so all that to say, the process has many flaws, and that is just one.
Here's what ended up happening with Morgan's case. Ian resigned as a pastor in 2023, but appealed to the PCA's highest court, called the Standing Judicial Commission. In November 2024, that court upheld discipline and decided to depose Ian. That's the term for making sure a pastor can't serve in the ministry in the PCA again.
We get so shocked. We probably ought not to be shocked, right? I think it's a poor understanding of sin to be so shocked. I think we ought to presume that with the number of pastors and elders that are out there, the Bible tells us, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves, right? The word tells us, there's going to be people without pure motives trying to share the gospel, And there's, stories in the Old Testament and the New Testament that demonstrate poor behavior on behalf of many people who are supposed to be carrying God's word and caring for the flock. But that being said, there are standards, and when a person demonstrates they're no longer fit for ministry, as soon as that becomes apparent, there should be swift action. And that is what is so appalling and surprising to me. Not that they're out there, but that this process operates to serve and protect the accused, rather than to presume that when somebody says, I was really hurt, to believe them and protect them and seek justice for them and have mercy on them. That's the part that's appalling. But it's all in black and white, and it's really hard to change in the PCA.
When TJ and I put out our episode about don't talk about it, right? And the pressure people felt to not talk about Elizabeth Mackintosh's murder, people came out of the woodwork to tell us stories, since 1990 about their own lives and things that had happened to them in the PCA, saying that culture of silence still feels very relevant and prevalent. And so for people like Morgan, who say they have experienced abuse under pastors, for other people that we've talked to who say they've been abused by pastors, we still think, again, it's important to talk about Elizabeth's murder and to think about how that culture of silence impacts the PCA, people in those churches, people connected to those churches today.
Who is checking in on their families to make sure that their families are okay? Who's doing all that? Who's shepherding the shepherds? That's what I want to know. Because a person can be completely healthy coming out of seminary and become completely unhealthy because he's isolated, overwhelmed, has poor management of self in terms of his locus of control or emotional capacity or whatever else might be an issue, past trauma. But who's going to notice that unless somebody's really looking? I don't know the answer to that. It's just a question.
So, like a lot of things in this whole project, right? There are still some unanswered questions. There's still an element of unknowing and unknowability. But we did want to bring things back to the case of Elizabeth Mackintosh. And TJ, I just wanted to bring you in here to see if there's anything new that we can share with listeners.
The short answer is no. There are no significant updates that we're aware of anyway. But I will say that we have been in touch with the Creve Coeur Police Department, and those interactions have been very encouraging. It's like a whole new generation of police officers. And so, it's not like they have any new evidence to work with, but it really seems like they're genuinely trying to take a run at it, and they're doing what they can with what little they have to work with. So whether that means the case is going to be solved, who knows? But they're trying.
Sure. Well, and a question people often ask me is the case still open? And the basic answer is yes. It remains open. Police remain interested in talking to anybody with information. We still believe this case is solvable. People just have to talk.